Hello, I'm Angela Rice Beamer. Welcome to our program. It's called Chautauqua. Chautauqua is a living history humanities program that showcases famous people in history. Scholars and actors portray these famous people on stage and in full costume. You get to learn about the lives of these people in a fun and factually accurate way. Each year there's a different theme, and this year's theme is Making Waves. It highlights the importance of the Earth's water and the courageous adventurers who explored it. Water is essential for life. Water sustains life. In 1933, while in the French Navy, tonight's Chautauqua character spent 2 years traveling the world's oceans. During World War II, he worked as an underwater cameraman and documentary filmmaker. He is quoted as saying, "The sea, once it casts its spell, holds one in its net of wonder forever." Tonight's Chautauqua character taught audiences worldwide about the treasures of the oceans and the dangers of polluting them. He's the innovative filmmaker and undersea explorer, Jacques Cousteau.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm pleased to be back in France. I'm pleased to speak my native tongue again. I've been in the United States, which they've been very kind to me over the years, but my English is a bit fractured, and so some make fun of me, some I don't understand what they're talking about, and Americans are quite aggressive. And I can't seem to go anywhere and have a normal life. So it's good to be back here in France to a meeting of the Cousteau Society. I'm very pleased by this, what Francine has put together. I was asked to make a few comments, and I don't usually do this because I'm more interested in the future than the past. But I was asked to make some comments about how we arrived here in the Cousteau Society and a bit about my history, and I thought, well, tonight I'll make an exception and talk about it. It came to me as I started to think about it that I wanted to speak about the fact that in my early life, the idea of being what I was called once man-fish, in 1948, when they first discovered what we were doing with scuba tanks, the aqualung, they called us man-fish, and that sort of stuck for a few years. Not a great name, but it was that. But before I became a man-fish, my entire career has evolved around the sea and bodies of water. I was very landlocked. As a child, I was very shy. I didn't communicate well with others. I also got in a great deal of trouble because of this. All my thoughts inside, and I acted out quite a bit. The only thing that kept me interested were any kind of technologic gizmo engineering device, or my brother, Pac, Philippe Alain Cousteau, but we all called him Pac. He was older by 5 or 6 years, and I really envied him. I idealized him. And so when he was joining the military, I was only 13, he was 19, something like that, and my father had encouraged him to join the Army. And I was left alone, and I really now got in more and more trouble. And one thing that seemed to save me after a bit, because I hated being around people, really uncomfortable, especially around women, girls, I purchased a little small camera, a hand crank 8mm camera, and so with this little camera I started taking pictures, and people seemed to enjoy having me around taking terrible movies of them. And then I started my film company to make wonderful comedies. Well, I thought they were wonderful, but they were usually about myself trying to ingratiate myself with some young lady, and this young lady, of course, would reject me in some way, shape, or form. Yeah, they were terrible films. But it opened me up some. Now, I was still a bad child, let's just say. When I was 17, I finally went too far. I'd forgotten what I had done. My mother took away the camera. She thought this would encourage better behavior. It had the opposite effect. And in what I described later in my defense as a scientific experiment, I broke out all the windows in the local high school with rocks, the experiment being, would a smaller rock create a smaller hole? So the year after that, I spent in reform school. And then I returned home probably no better off, no better as a person, because my father said, well, it's time for you to go. And he sent me to join the Navy. Now, I had no desire to be on water. Water to me had no interest at all. In my 4 years of naval training, and I took a round-the-world cruise, I saw the ocean and water simply as something to get across. Something, an impediment to what I wanted to do, which was work on engines or something like that. Or just hide, basically. And I had no interest in it at all. In 1933, after 4 years in the Navy, I decided I wanted more technology. And so I enrolled to become a pilot, a naval pilot. 4 years of training. And right at the end of my training, the only interest I really had on land, besides film, was to race my father's automobile around the mountain roads as fast as I possibly could, often without his permission. Anyway, on the last days of my training, I borrowed, this time my father knew it, as a present for finishing flight school. Before I graduated, I would be able to take a drive, and I went up in the mountains and proceeded to crash the automobile, breaking both arms, almost losing my left arm, shattering 12 ribs, and my flight career was over. But this fortuitous event, in a way, out of sometimes catastrophic problems come positive things. Out of this, I picked up my camera again. I hadn't touched it in years, and went to a party. And at the party, picked on this one young lady who looked beautiful. I found out she was the admiral's daughter. And it found out that she actually found me not at all reprehensible. And so we became an item because of this accident. But also because of the accident, and we were married the next year and had our honeymoon, and then I was assigned as still part of the Navy. They assigned me as a gunnery officer to the French fleet in Toulon. And off I went. Simone with me. I was assigned to a young captain named Philippe Telise. And I couldn't still do much because of my arm, my left arm especially. It still didn't function properly. He said, the perfect thing for you would be to go swimming. I swim every weekend. Why don't we go off swimming? I said, well, I don't really care. And he said, no, come with me. And he sort of ordered me, and so off I went. And I would swim on the surface, but I didn't really enjoy it. He, on the other hand, was a skin diver, a term I had not heard, or free diver. He had taken aviator goggles and taped them to his face so they wouldn't leak water, and then stuck a 2-foot hose into his mouth, garden hose. And for his feet, he had fins that were 2 pieces of rubber that encased a steel saw blade to give it rigidity that he welded onto his feet somehow. I don't remember. And then he would go off and chase fish, and he had a spear gun at the time, which was a brass curtain rod sharpened to a tip, and he fired it with a bicycle inner tube that the 2 ends were tied around his wrist, and he'd cock it back like this and sort of aim it and shoot. And we ate a lot of fish because he was pretty good at it. But he kept saying I should go underwater, and I had no desire to. And finally, he just ordered me. This went on for a month or so. And he finally said, you're going to do this. Oh, fine. And I put on all the equipment, and he sort of gave me an idea how to do it. And so it was that moment I put my face down in the water, and for the first time with the goggles on, could see things under the water. I saw colors. I saw shapes. I saw fish who swam right up to me. They were everywhere. And then I looked up and looked at the sky and the shore, and then put my face back down. If we're lucky, we have that moment in our life when we know everything has changed. This was that moment when when the path we're on, which I didn't even really know what path that was going to change to this new path that I was going to pursue headlong, wherever it went. And I had no idea where it would go, except I wanted to spend more time underwater. I said, well, how do I go under? He showed me how to dive, and I did a series of deep dives down at least 2-3 feet under the water. You have to learn how to do it. But I wanted to be more and more under the water. And so I grabbed giant stones and walked out as deep as I could and then tried to swim as far as I could to go under with the stones and stay on the bottom watching whatever swam by. And then when I was completely out of air, let go of the stones and jet up to the surface. More and more, I wanted to spend time underwater. Well, Philippe and I met this other young man, Didi Dumas. And we became the Three Musketeers of the ocean, we called ourselves. And we went diving every day, skin diving, and we tried to hit things with that. We'd chase lobster down, feeding people. Of course, this was during the Depression, the end of the Depression, so we had extra food often, and we sold it to people on the beach or gave it away. But there was a new world for me now. Of course, things changed dramatically as the war came on. Of course, the Nazis rolled into France and France surrendered. In the year right before that, we had the Three Musketeers. I had taken a little camera that had a wind-up motor to it, so I would wind it up, an 8mm camera, wound it up, had a pickle jar. Didi held the pickle jar, and then I'd wind it as tight as it would go, and then start it, shove it in the pickle jar. Philippe would tighten on the screw cap as tight as he could. I'd grab it and jump underwater, and they would swim around facing into the pickle jar. These were not good films either. They were distorted. You don't see well out of a pickle jar. Who knew? And so this went on, but we kept filming. This was the first time anyone had filmed underwater with an underwater camera. And of course, it leaked like crazy, so we spent half of the time taking it out, putting it in fresh water, learning how to save it. We also this time developed the wetsuit at first. We were cold, and so we put grease on our body. Someone said, well, you keep the water from flowing over your skin, you'll be warmer. So we put grease on. It doesn't work. It does the opposite. And then you also have the problem of trying to get the grease off, which is sitting on the beach rubbing sand to get this mess off your body. Terrible. Didi went home and took a rubber raincoat and took an iron and started welding the seams tight and then making them smaller so they fit fairly snug, and hence the first wet suit. It does not keep out water. That's why it's called a wet suit. But it traps a layer of air or a layer of water that your body heats up and it stays. And as long as you don't keep exchanging that water, you can stay fairly warm. 1939, we experimented. Now, the magic of the underseas world, mankind has always been interested by it. D.H. Lawrence once said, there are 3 elements of water. There's 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen, and the other part is mystery. And humans, since the dawn of time, probably have looked in water and wonder what was underneath it. This mystery had caused that we've been fascinated by it, but haven't been able to do much about it. Alexander the Great put a bucket over his head, basically, and went underwater for about a minute before he almost suffocated, trying to look at the fish, but without a lens, he couldn't see anything. Of course, the first real diver, I guess, was Edward Halley of Halley's Comet fame. He took a glass-bottom bucket, put it over his head, and had a young man swim to him with bladders of air that they trapped on the surface and push it into the tub so he could stay underwater at about 10, 12 feet. He stayed for about a minute and a half, 2 minutes. Well, since then, there have been some change in technology, and what we latched onto was called a rebreather, which takes oxygen in a closed circuit and scrubs it to take this carbon dioxide out as you breathe. The only problem with that is, as we found out in the first 2 tries, the first try, we didn't put enough oxygen in. So when you run out of oxygen, and it's mostly carbon dioxide, you basically pass out, which is what I did. Out cold on the bottom, and Dee Dee dragged me to the shore and revived me. My first near-death experience underwater, Simone was not pleased. And then the next day I said, well, okay, I just need to make sure I give myself more oxygen. And so we did. Except the only problem with oxygen, once you get down about 20, 30 feet, is it's pressurized, it bubbles out more, and you go into convulsions, which is what I did the second time. Dee Dee dragged me out again, mostly dead, revived me. Simone tried to kill me shortly afterwards. And this is the way it was. People think as an explorer that I have some thrill-seeking. It wasn't. I mean, we were trying something new, and each experiment, each failure induced us, since our own personal safety was involved, gave us a great passion to try to make things right. But we always desired to come back, always, from every dive. Come back safe. It's not about dying, it is about exploration, pushing boundaries, finding out information. Every time we dove, every time we go underwater, we learn something new, every single time. Well, at this stage, we gave up on the rebreathers. Of course, about this time, as I said, Germany had taken over France, and we were part of the Vichy Navy in Toulon, which meant we were French, but we couldn't go out. The Germans wouldn't allow it. The Germans left us alone. But we had nothing to do. So we dove every day, practically, because there was nothing to do. I purchased a 35 millimeter camera, and a friend of mine, Emile Gagnon, a very good engineer, designed and built a watertight case for it. This had a hand crank, 35 millimeter, just like a movie film, and I thought this was great. And there were water seals and that, and so it only leaked a little bit. So, I mean, every dive we probably had to rebuild the camera. The problem was the Nazis had said no, they wanted all the 35 millimeter film. They needed it for whatever use they used it for. So Simone said to me, well, isn't still pictures 35 millimeter film? I said, yes, but it comes in a roll. There's only 12 exposures on it. We need 50 feet. They're only about 3 feet long. Well, can't we buy a bunch of rolls and splice them together? Okay, and this is how we made our film. We spliced 50 feet together of still images, put it in the camera, and started to shoot a film. A real film this time. The next thing that happened was quite advantageous in a way. My brother had become a sympathizer with the Nazis. He had similar anti-Semitic views. Anyway, with his connections, he had gotten us a letter saying that we were Reich-approved biologists, underwater biologists. And so we were left alone to do whatever we wished. Well, that was filming. Then the next thing that was fortuitous, and not really fortuitous, but Emile Gagnon and myself decided that we had compressed air cylinders. But if you take them underwater, many of them are like at 2,000 pounds of pressure. If you turn it on, you're basically going to blow your face right off with the pressure. If you turn it on slow, you could sort of slurp the air and stay underwater. The problem was you had both hands occupied, and you couldn't see anything because of the bubbles, and you certainly couldn't film. This was unacceptable. And I said, why don't we design a valve? And so we did. The first stage breaks the air pressure down to about 15 pounds. And the second stage would have a valve, a demand valve. So when you breathe in, you get air. When you stop breathing, it shuts off. You don't waste the air. In 1943, we had it all ready to go. Of course, at this moment, as the Germans moved into Vichy. We have been ordered that if this happened, because we were all expecting it, we would destroy the French fleet. And so we did. I took part in that. And we blew up what was it, 30-some military ships. This now gave us another advantage. We had absolutely nothing to do now. We had no Navy. We didn't even have to fake coming down because the Germans didn't want to see us, so we just went diving. And we're filming. And with our new tank in 1943, I had the opportunity to go underwater, not just in 15-second increments. The first films were all shot in 15 seconds, what we had done to that time, 15 seconds. But now I stayed underwater in the first dive at 60 feet, finally 60 feet, for 60 minutes. The opportunity to expand what we could see, where we could go, was astronomical. There was this moment where we now had the key, this key to unlock this new world that man had never seen. Man had wondered about the sea, but never been there. But at this time, think of it this way, we had better maps of Mars and Venus, even today, than we really have of the Atlantic Ocean seafloor. We have only seen 10% of the ocean and the wonders that lie in there. And this was the tool. And we were in a new world, and this new world had new rules. We had to learn many things about it, but one of them was that we were weightless. On Earth, we are bound down. We are bolted to the ground by gravity. In the water, we were weightless. Just moving our fingers or our feet, and we could take off in another direction. It was this incredible experience. Of course, it dramatically increased our film time, dramatically increased what we could do, and we finished our second film in 1942 called 60 Feet Down. And we kept working on more films and doing more things because we'd had no real obligations. My only obligation, and no one knew this at the time, no one around me, that occasionally I would dress up as an Italian naval officer and walk through the German defenses at Toulon. What they didn't understand was under my jacket was my old 8mm camera. And I filmed German defenses for the French resistance. My little contribution to the war. Not much came of it, but it was definitely rather anxiety-filled. But the war finally came to an end, and by that time we had been down. I had gone to 135 feet, but come up too fast and was the first to really discover the bends. Simone tried to kill me after that one as well. A few days later, Didi went down to 210 feet. We quickly surmised that you just couldn't go to the surface very quickly. That was our problem. Well, he didn't even get that far because at 210 feet, what happens is what they called at the time rapture of the deep, which is just nitrogen narcosis. Nitrogen under pressure makes you do the silliest things in the world. You become giddy. You take, as he did, he took out his regulator to offer it to a fish. Almost drowned, and we dragged him to the surface. Simone was still angry with me about this as well. But we learned a great deal, and we did more and more, and we filmed a third film, which was called Shipwreck. Shipwreck went on to win the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival right after the war. You know, after the war, I thought we would keep making movies, and we did for a bit, but I wanted more. I wanted to get out of the Navy and do something more elaborate, more exciting. This is 1951. And by that time, my picture had been in Life magazine, and I'd been called Manfish in the other magazines, and so there was some popularity, and I had spoken at a meeting like this about what we really needed was a ship. And this young man came up, and he said, "What kind of ship do you need?" And I said, "Well, we have our eyes on a several 100-foot-long ship that needs to be very durable, and da-da." And he said, "Well, I have money," since he was the heir to the Guinness beer fortune. And he said, "I have money, but I'm not going to purchase you a ship. What I'll do, though, is I'll purchase a ship, and I'll lease it to you for £1 a year." And that is how Calypso, came into my life. A 130-foot World War II American minesweeper that we refitted with every little penny we had. He bought the ship, he didn't refit it. Then we had to find a crew. And I had to find young men, like Didi Dumas was with me, and young men who were willing to go on this great adventure. We had no idea where we were going. We had no idea when we would be back. We had no idea how we would make any money. All we could guarantee is that you would spend a great deal of time working, time underwater, and fish. Lots of fish to eat. I found this extraordinary group of men who joined me. And we had this great camaraderie. We would shake hands. It's a French naval tradition. You shake hands with each member each time you see them each morning when you say hello. And at night, before you go to bed, you shake hands. And the camaraderie was great. Everyone idealistic and working hard. And of course, we needed a great ship. Calypso we were suspicious of, but we had it at the right price and it worked to our service. Of course, the first time going across the Mediterranean, a huge storm came up. Huge waves, and we were quite terrified. Especially more so when we had remodeled the ship, but we hadn't done anything to the fuel tanks. So in the storm, they got agitated quite a bit, and dirt and filth in the bottom of the tank clogged up the injectors and shut the engines down. So we were loose in the Mediterranean in 30-foot seas with an unpowered ship. This is not a safe thing. We put on our life preservers. I remember distinctly Simone looking at me with this, I'm going to kill you if we do survive this. But we were pretty sure we were going into the ocean. It was battered side to side. At one point, it tilted almost 45 degrees, and the sea broke over completely over it. And we knew this was it. And it righted itself. And it did this again. And we suddenly realized that this was an amazingly adaptable and vibrant life force ship itself. We finally got one of the engines running, and we made safety, but we knew we now had our ship. So we spent the 50s making films. I wrote a book in 1952 called The Undersea World. National Geographic had encouraged me to write it. We didn't believe that it would be sold in 21 languages and sell roughly 500,000 copies the first year. It was amazing. And then National Geographic says, you should make this into a movie. So I hired a young cameraman to go with me, a young man who had all the things we needed. He was skilled with the camera. He was young and didn't care what happened, and he was rich, so we didn't have to pay him. And off we went. His name was Louis Malle, if you know, the great film director. For 10 years, many people don't know, he was the Calypso's film, the head of filming. Anyway, we made another film called The Silent World. It won not only a Palme d'Or, but it won our first Oscar. And when we filmed the Conshelf experiments in the 1960s, 61, 63, 64, we filmed those, and that became our fourth major film, which was called A World Without Sun. Conshelf, we decided that the problem with diving is you dive down, and then when you come up, you have so much nitrogen in your blood, you have to wait a while at the surface, and then when you finally get to we're below the surface to decompress. And once you get on the surface, then you have an interval before you can go back in the water again. And each time you do this, you have less and less of an interval. Well, it's very hard to get any effective work done. So we decided we would try saturation diving. Nobody had done this. Put them in a sphere, drop the sphere to the bottom, let them work at 35 feet, and leave them there. Don't come to the surface. If you don't come to the surface, you don't have any problems. So 2 men stayed for 7 days, and Conshelf won. And it showed that we could do this. So we did it again, and many mistakes that we made. We did it again at 80 feet in the water with now, this time, 7 men for 30 days. Well, we realized at that depth and that long, in 30 days, we could do more work than we'd done normally in 2 to 3 years. We could explore so much more because you could dive 10, 12 hours a day. You could stay out as long as you wished. Then we tried Conshelf 3, which the oil companies were interested in. We took it down to 325 feet. And they stayed for 27 days, 7 men. This was like going to the moon because there was no way up. There was no quick emergency exit. If something went wrong, they would die. It was a staggering thing, but that's what we filmed. Well, by then we had more ambition, and PBS had come to me and said, you know what you really should do instead of films? Make television shows. And we could reach more people, and for a variety of reasons, I wanted to do that. And so in 1966, we signed a contract with National Geographic, and not PBS, but ABC, to produce the undersea worlds of Jacques Cousteau. We had spent 15 years making movies. Now we would spend the next 17, 19 years producing television. 4 series over the years. There was one difficulty, though. It was more ambitious. We had to produce 6 hours of film a year. Well, it had taken us 2 years to make each one of our 1-hour movies. 6 hours in 1 year meant we had to be at sea constantly, which meant we had to change crews all the time. The camaraderie disappeared because we had to keep changing men in and out. And everyone had to be an expert in their field, and we could take no shirkers. There was no job that wasn't important, so if you couldn't work well, you had to go. It had to be much more cutthroat, if you will. There were more demands, more money, more needs of more money, more ambition. We didn't need just one ship, Calypso. Well, it's in the Atlantic. What about the Pacific? The viewers need to see more. Okay, well, we have to go to the Pacific. Well, we'll get a ship to go to the Pacific, but first we'll use a flying boat from World War II, a PBY. My son Philippe, by that time, was a pilot, and he would fly it island to island and dive off of the plane and make films for the next TV show. The demands were extraordinary. By 1979, of course, in the middle of the second series on PBS this time, Oasis on Earth. No, it was the next one. I'm sorry, Odyssey. On Odyssey, of course, Philippe crashed and was killed. Simone quit. She had been in Calypso all these years, but she had no heart for it anymore. So she went ashore. Our relationship had been strained dramatically by all of this. But we needed to raise more money and keep going. So my son, Jean-Michel, Michael, as most one called him, Michael came aboard, even though he didn't really want to, but he came aboard and started to take Philippe's place and Simone's place, and we filmed, and we kept driving ourselves through the TBS series and up the Amazon River and all over the world. We gained our second ship, which was a wind-powered electric ship, if you wish. But more and more of these demands. Of course, several years ago, Simone passed away as well. And people asked me about this. I kept going on, which has irritated many in my family, even Michael. And I've said that to me, death is part of life. It's horrible, but it's also important because with death, we understand and appreciate life more. Maybe that's why I don't look back very often. I've lost many good friends in this great adventure. The last thing I wanted to just mention quickly, something amazing happened about the time we started onto television. I had been an idea to report what I had seen. I'm not a scientist. I never claimed to be a scientist. Some people faulted us and said, well, Cousteau pretends he's a scientist. I never did. I say that I'm an impartial observer. I go underwater and I film and tell you what I've seen. And I leave it to experts in the audience to draw most conclusions. I merely surmise what I see. But I decided that instead of just chronicling and charting this, we needed to speak out about what we were seeing more and more. Become what some have called me an environmentalist. to worry that we need to protect these places. It cleared to me that in the southern France area along the coast, what I had seen in the 1930s was gone by the mid-60s. The fish were gone. Plants were gone. The corals were almost gone. Whole species were disappeared. Those fish that we found and lobster that we could catch so easily, it was impossible to find them. And we found this in other places, and everybody was telling us the stories about the degradation. Fishermen out in Fiji saying, well, yes, there's no fish anymore. We have to go further and further. So I knew I had to become more of an activist for this, that I had to speak on this. Because so much is gone, and we need to have regulations about this, because it's clear to me that the undersea world that is so vital to all our lives in a way that I knew as a child or as a young man is not what my sons know. And now with my grandchildren, they'll never understand what it was like. But worse than that, it seems to be getting worse. People ask them, I'm optimistic, and I'm not. In a way, I believe we're closer to the end of this world underwater than we are to a solution to stop this degradation. I am very concerned by that. What's ironic about this is if you saw my early movies, I was not an environmentalist. The early Calypso crew was not. We killed sharks because they killed a whale and ate a whale. We saw sharks as savages to be killed at any opportunity. We dynamited reefs to kill the fish, to have them float to the surface so I could identify these species. Things I look at and am appalled by today. Capturing sea lions and dolphins and turning them into aquariums and that as pet tricks to work for mankind in some circus fashion. I'm appalled by that. I'm appalled that I was part of the Bathscape program. It was to send a man, the same Auguste Piccard, if you remember, had taken a balloon up into the atmosphere, the highest anyone in the 50s. He wanted to go underwater, the deeper than anyone, and so he designed the submarine. Of course, submarines need ballast to get down. This was before and this kind of submarine to go that deep couldn't have all the mechanical devices like a normal sub. Anyway, the ballast was 2,500 pounds of gasoline. And it had to be dumped each time to send the Bathscape back up. At that time, it didn't mean anything to me. Now, I'm horrified by what we had done. You learn, I guess. And I will keep trying to report on what I have found. And I'm going to keep trying to pressure governments around the world to take action, to try to use renewable resources. Like I say, we now have a ship that runs on electricity from wind. Use solar. We had, England's coal powered the first centuries of human progress. And then America's oil. I think soon it will be our sun that powers it. And our ocean waves, or our wind. All these things we need to improve to save our planet. Think of it this way. Our planet is mostly liquid, and the land is our lifeboat. And we're all stuck in this same lifeboat together. And our doom will be together as well. So rich and poor nations need to work together to solve these incredible problems. Finally, people say to me, why do you go on? Even given this sort of pessimism about where you're at and what you do now. And it's simple, really. When you think about it, the whale, the dolphin, any creature, their enjoyment of life is from just their existence. That they exist is their enjoyment. For humanity, we enjoy that we exist, but there's more. We must marvel at our existence and marvel at the world that we exist in. That's why I continue to dive. That is why I continue to explore. and that is the work of the Cousteau Society. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for staying with us. I'm here with Doug Mishler, who's just performed as Jacques Cousteau. Thanks for being here again.
It's great to be back.
You're a Maryland Chautauqua favorite.
Well, I always enjoy coming to Maryland. It's always so much fun. Like tonight, we had a great group of people with great questions afterwards, so that's wonderful.
Wonderful. Well, it's good to see you again. Well, when I finished The Sea King, I was filled with emotion. Mm-hmm. And didn't exactly know where I was going with it. It wasn't that I was ready to cry, but he had such a far-reaching life. Mm-hmm. Can you comment on that a little bit, and maybe that description might not be how you would describe his life?
Well, his life is incredibly complex. His career is so long and so varied, and it comes with so many moments that are magical, that change everything, but also change him. And in a way, I got the feeling when I read all the materials on him that there was a little bit of wistfulness for the old days, right after World War II, and even in World War II, when it was sort of seat of your pants. They didn't know where they were going, what they were going to do, how they were going to make money at this adventure, and it was this raw adventure.
Really, a true adventure across the world, across the seas of the world. Yeah. Jean-Michel said of his father that the work of my father is a hymn to life. Mm-hmm. I thought that was a wonderful way to put it. Do you have some comments about that statement? A hymn to life.
I think it's a really wonderful comment. He talks about, one of my favorite lines that I found of his was the magic, the mystery of water. He quotes D.H. Lawrence as saying water has 3 parts, not 2. There's hydrogen and oxygen, but there's also the mystery of it, the wonder of it. And I think that's one of the things about Cousteau, was always that mystery, the wonder. So a hymn, perhaps.
And he brought that to life for the rest of the world to see.
Because he really did.
People wouldn't have been able to, had he not had that camera, and that camera as a child helped him so much to relieve his shyness. It may not have gone that way. Yeah.
Yes, and then, as I said, I came into this character because he was a childhood hero of mine, and I became a scuba diver and scuba instructor because of Jacques Cousteau, almost directly. That and an old TV show called Sea Hunt.
With Lloyd Bridges.
With Lloyd Bridges, yeah, the old diving.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Interesting. That TV could help change a life or many lives.
Oh, yes, yeah, and I think Cousteau, with diving and how we look at the ocean and how many people scuba dive now and spend time, in this other world that he talks about, a world that humans are aliens in, and yet it's 70% of our Earth.
Can you tell me a little bit more, because you talked a little bit about them in the presentation, the Three Musketeers.
Yeah, the Three Musketeers. Early in his career, once he started going underwater, it was with the captain he was assigned to work with as a young lieutenant. His captain was Philippe Telliez, and Philippe Telliez is really the one who forced him to really start skin diving and stick his face under the water with a mask on and suddenly see all these sights that he had never dreamed were there or never cared about. And all of a sudden it's there. And then they were joined by Didi Dumas, a local, I didn't talk about it much tonight, but you get this idea that he was this good-looking young Frenchman who had all these girls around him at all times. Cousteau made a comment at one point that they could be alone on the beach, and as soon as Didi showed up, women would show up. He was this magnet for women. And together, the three of them just start diving almost every day from 1937 through 1944, right through the war, every weekend for sure, and as much time, because they had so much free time, though they also found that the way to find food, because food was in short supply in France during the occupation, and so they were feeding themselves and other people and their families. And it's quite a fascinating story of the three of them. And I think that's one of the great things about Cousteau, is that adventure that it was at the beginning.
Absolutely. It just spanned it spanned the world, really. He had documentaries that I hadn't heard about. I didn't realize that he had explored Antarctica. And I saw a video, well, actually it was a film, but it was on the internet, about being in Antarctica.
Yep.
And they were fearless. They were climbing an iceberg type of thing that he named the Sphinx, because it had a similar look to the Sphinx. And they got out of this little boat and started climbing it. And I was thinking they were fearless but not reckless.
I think that's what they would say. Now, climbing one of those is really reckless, but that was sort of their determination of that. Yeah, that they're fearless, not reckless. I guess they felt like, well, if we go in the water, we know how to get ourselves out of water, so they'd be fine. But yeah, everything that they did, one of my favorite stories is they took Calypso up the St. Lawrence Seaway in the wintertime, and they had so much ice all over the boat, they spent every day pounding ice off of the ship. And it's some very funny stories about that, because it just wasn't comfortable at all.
There was another story that about them in the, Didi and Cousteau were doing a dive. It's something called the Fountain. They were trying to find the source of it, and almost everything went wrong in that particular.
Right, everything they tried, and it was a cave system. It was one of the first times anyone had tried to dive in a cave system, which currently it's a rarity. Only highly trained divers dive in caves or deep penetration dives, because if you do get in trouble, in recreational diving, if you get in trouble, you just go up. In caves, it may be a long way to get out. It's much more serious. And yeah, it was a comedy of errors that almost killed them several times. And then part of it, they've realized later, when Gagnon, the engineer, came and said, well, your air intake for the compressor is right next to the exhaust. You're poisoning yourself with carbon monoxide. It gets to the point of their desire to do something, and sometimes not fully thinking out what's the difference between fearless and a daredevil with a death wish, in a way.
And you mentioned in your performance Simone, wanting to kill him because of these adventures that he went on.
Yeah, because he had so many times where he almost died. There are 4 or 5 clearly times when he almost died. It should have died if someone else had not been there to pull him out. And the same they had done with Didi, had several times where he almost died. And in fact, one of their men I've forgotten what year, I think it was 70, died diving to 485 feet, and he died. So they understood the dangers of what they were doing and pushing the limits.
But followed the calling anyway.
But did it anyway, trying to see what the limits were and how deep man could dive.
With the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau, that series that so many people watched.
Yeah, the original one.
After a while, the audience began to wane, and it was canceled in favor of sitcoms.
Yes.
So much for
ABC said sitcoms were the way, even though they had made 4 Emmys. They were waning, but it was still very popular. And that's why PBS picked it right up and changed it. But by then, Cousteau wanted to go in a slightly different direction and more make it a proselytizing against the evils of capitalism in a way, and the pollution of the seas. And that didn't work too well, because even PBS said this is just too polemic, too righteously angry. We need to make it more fun again and focus on science more.
And John Denver and Ted Turner were instrumental in bringing more of Cousteau's films to the audience.
Right.
Cable was very young at that point.
Ted Turner, with his new network, and he had all these hours to fill, purchased the almost all the old films and TV shows and showed them while he gave a large sum of money to Cousteau and Calypso to start a new journey, which was called Rediscovery in 83 to 85. So,
yeah, quite an adventure. That's all I can really say. He went to Cuba. He had and met with Castro.
Yep.
And one of the things I read was that he was instrumental in 50 political prisoners being released.
Yeah, I've heard this story as well. Yes, that he was. It's an intriguing thing. It sounds more like a Castro idea than than Cousteau idea, but he had influence, and being there drew so much attention to the island. Cuba is known for, because of their lack of a heavy industrial economy, they have a wonderful reef system around Cuba. A lot of scuba divers are desperately trying to get into Cuba to go scuba diving. So I could see that. The story was interesting to me always.
In the film that I saw, they did show how clear the waters were and how full the ecology of the ocean was there. The one thing that struck me was that Cousteau spoke to Castro. He wasn't talking about the political prisoners, but he was talking about him being about Castro having this single idea of how everything worked. And I thought that was kind of a bold statement. So I could believe where they had more conversations and he would perhaps release the prisoners. Cousteau gave very convincing arguments in that film.
And the thing about Castro, he was very open to people to debate and loved to talk, and perhaps Cousteau had a positive effect on him.
Right time,
right place, yeah. And of course, it was also, if he can bring divers into Cuba, of course, tourist money would be very, very helpful to an island that has so many needs.
Yes. He finally got the popularity that he kind of craved as a child, as a shy, sort of lonely child. Got that popularity. And you talked a little about his brother. And what became of his brother? Because the TV audience has not heard what you said.
Well, his brother becomes a collaborator with the Nazis. Even before the Nazis arrive, he becomes involved with several newspapers which have sort of a right-wing slant, and he makes several anti-Semitic comments. He makes some comments about Franklin Roosevelt being a Jew and these kinds of things. There's no evidence that Jacques shared these views at all. Nobody in the family, as far as we know. And we don't know exactly what led Pack. Pack is his nickname for it. But then, of course, when the war's over, he tries to flee to Eastern Europe and is captured by the French, is sentenced to die, as were all collaborators. And then the French government basically said, yeah, we don't really want to do that to a lot of people. So they sentenced him to life in prison. I've forgotten how long it was. I think he spent 10 or 11 years, and then his sentence for most of them was commuted, and they were allowed with time served. And he gets out, and a few years later, he passes away.
Because he had health problems.
He had health problems by then.
What is next for you? We don't have much time. We probably got about a minute and a half. What's next for you?
Well, tomorrow night I go off to Catonsville. I look forward to that. But going home and getting my theater back operating fully, I've been gone, and so I need to get back. And I've been working on several new characters. I do Tesla. Nikola Tesla is coming up. And as I said, blurted out Picasso. I've been working on Picasso and performing him this summer, and so it's been busy. New characters, it looks like.
You have so many, I don't know how you keep them straight.
Yeah,
I
sometimes
just
it's
can't
hard.
imagine. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. You've been watching Chautauqua. Our theme has been making waves, and we've seen a character who did definitely make waves. I'm Angela Rice Beamer from the Germantown campus of Montgomery College. Good night.